I felt uncomfortable even in the confessional in church. It was a normal enough fear, and now I realized as I protested to Lestat, I did not actually feel this anymore. I was simply remembering it, hanging on to it from habit, from a deficiency of ability to recognize my present and exhilarating freedom. "You're carrying on badly," Lestat said finally, "and it's almost dawn. I should let you die. You will die, you know. The sun will destroy the blood I've given you, in every tissue, every vein. But you shouldn't be feeling this fear at all. I think you're like a man who loses an arm or a leg and keeps insisting that he can feel pain where the arm or leg used to be." Well, that was positively the most intelligent and useful thing Lestat ever said in my presence, and it brought me around at once. "Now I'm getting into the coffin," he finally said to me in his most disdainful tone, "and you will get in on top of me if you know what's good for you." And I did. I lay face down on him, utterly confused by my absence of dread and filled with a distaste for being so close to him, handsome and intriguing though he was. And he shut the lid. Then I asked him if I was completely dead. My body was tingling and itching all over. "No, you're not then," he said. "When you are, you'll only hear and see it changing and feel nothing. You should be dead by tonight. Go to sleep." Was he right? Were you dead when you woke up? Yes, changed, I should say. As obviously I am alive, my body was dead. It was some time before it became absolutely cleansed of the fluids and matter it no longer needed, but it was dead. And with the realization of it came another stage in my divorce from human emotions. The first thing which became apparent to me, even while Lestat and I were loading the coffin into a hearse and stealing another coffin from a mortuary, was that I did not like Lestat at all. I was far from being his equal yet, but I was infinitely closer to him than I had been before the death of my body. I can't really make this clear to you for the obvious reason that you are now as I was before. My body died. You cannot understand, but before I died, Lestat was absolutely the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Your cigarette has become one long cylindrical ash. Oh, the boy quickly ground the filter into the glass. You mean that when the gap was closed between you, he lost his spell? He asked, his eyes quickly fixed on the vampire, his hands now producing a cigarette and match much more easily than before. Yes, that's correct, said the vampire with obvious pleasure. The trip back to Pointe du Lac was thrilling, and the constant chatter of Lestat was positively the most boring and disheartening thing I experienced. Of course, as I said, I was far from being his equal. I had my dead limbs to contend with, to use his comparison. And I learned that on that very night when I had to make my first kill. The vampire reached across the table now and gently brushed an ash from the boy's lapel. And the boy stared at his withdrawing hand in alarm. "Excuse me," said the vampire. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "Excuse me," said the boy. "I just got the impression suddenly that your arm was abnormally long. You reached so far without moving." "No," said the vampire, resting his hands again on his crossed knees. "I moved forward much too fast for you to see. It was an illusion." "You moved forward? But you didn't. You were just sitting, just as you are now, with your back against the chair." "No," repeated the vampire firmly. "I moved forward as I told you. Here, I'll do it again." And he did it again, and the boy stared with the same mixture of confusion and fear. "You still didn't see it?" said the vampire. "But you see, if you look at my outstretched arm now, it's really not remarkably long at all." And he raised his arm, first finger pointing heavenward as if he were an angel, about to give the word of the Lord. You have experienced a fundamental difference between the way you see and I see. My gesture appeared slow and somewhat languid to me, and the sound of my finger brushing your coat was quite audible. Well, I didn't mean to frighten you, I confess, but perhaps you can see from this that my return to Pointe du Lac was a feast of new experiences, the mere swaying of a tree branch in the wind, a delight. "Yes," said the boy, but he was still visibly shaken. The vampire eyed him for a moment, and then he said, "I was telling you about your first kill," said the boy. "Yes. I should say first, however, that the plantation was in a state of pandemonium. The overseer's body had been found, and so had the blind old man in the master bedroom. And no one could explain the blind old man's presence, and no one had been able to find me in New Orleans. My sister had contacted the police, and several of them were at Pointe du Lac when I had arrived. It was already quite dark, naturally, and Lestat quickly explained to me that I must not let the police see me in even minimal light, especially not with my body in its present remarkable state. So I talked to them in the Avenue of Oaks before the plantation house, ignoring their requests that we go inside. I explained I'd been to Pointe du Lac the night before, and the blind old man was my guest. As for the overseer, he had not been here, but had gone to New Orleans on business. After that was settled, during which my new detachment served me admirably, I had the problem of the plantation itself. My slaves were in a state of complete confusion, and no work had been done all day. We had a large plant then for the making of the indigo dye, and the overseer's management had been most important. But I had several extremely intelligent slaves who might have done his job just as well a long time before, if I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their African appearance and manner. I studied them clearly now and gave the management of things over to them. To the best, I gave the overseer's house on a promise. 2 of the young women were brought back into the house from the fields to care for Lestat's father, and I told them I wanted as much privacy as possible, and they would all of them be rewarded, not only for service, but for leaving me and Lestat absolutely alone. I did not realize at the time that these slaves would be the first and possibly the only ones to ever suspect that Lestat and I were not ordinary creatures. I failed to realize that their experience with the supernatural was far greater than that of white men. In my own inexperience, I still thought of them as childlike savages barely domesticated by slavery. I made a bad mistake. But let me keep to my story. I was going to tell you about my first kill. Lestat bungled it with his characteristic lack of common sense. Bungled it? Asked the boy. I should never have started with human beings, but this was something I had to learn by myself. Lestat had us plunge headlong into the swamps right after the police and the slaves were settled. It was very late, and the slave cabins were completely dark. We soon lost sight of the lights of Pointe du Lac altogether, and I became very agitated. It was the same thing again. Remembered fears, confusion. Lestat, had he any native intelligence, might have explained things to me patiently and gently, that I had no need to fear the swamps, that the snakes and insects I was utterly invulnerable, that I must concentrate on my new ability to see in total darkness. Instead, he harassed me with condemnations. He was concerned only with our victims, with finishing my initiation and getting on with it. And when we finally came upon our victims, he rushed me into action. They were a small camp of runaway slaves. Lestat had visited them before and picked off perhaps 1/4 of their number, by watching from the dark for one of them to leave the fire, or by taking them in their sleep. They knew absolutely nothing of Lestat's presence. We had to watch for well over an hour before one of the men, they were all men, finally left the clearing and came just a few paces into the trees. He unhooked his pants now and attended to an ordinary physical necessity, and as he turned to go, Lestat shook me and said, "Take him!" The vampire smiled at the boy's wide eyes. "I think I was about as horror-struck as you would be," he said, "but I didn't know then that I might kill animals instead of humans." I said quickly I could not possibly take him, and the slave heard me speak. He turned, his back to the distant fire, and peered into the dark. Then quickly and silently he drew a long knife out of his belt. He was naked except for the pants and the belt, a tall, strong-armed, sleek young man. He said something in the French patois, and then he stepped forward. I realized that, though I saw him clearly in the dark, he could not see us. Lestat stepped in back of him with a swiftness that baffled me and got a hold around his neck, while he pinned his left arm. The slave cried out and tried to throw Lestat off. He sank his teeth now, and the slave froze as if from snakebite. He sank to his knees, and Lestat fed fast as the other slaves came running. "You sicken me," he said when he got back to me. It was as if we were black insects utterly camouflaged in the night, watching the slaves move, oblivious to us, discover the wounded man, drag him back, fan out in the foliage, searching for the attacker. "Come on, we have to get another one before they all return to camp," he said, and quickly we set off after one man who was separated from the others. I was still terribly agitated, convinced I couldn't bring myself to attack, and feeling no urge to do so. There were many things, as I mentioned, which Lestat might have said and done. He might have made the experience rich in so many ways, but he did not. "What could he have done?" the boy asked. "What do you mean?" "Killing is no ordinary act," said the vampire. "One doesn't simply glut oneself on blood." He shook his head. "It is the experience of another's life for certain, and often the experience of the loss of that life through the blood, slowly. It is again and again the experience of that loss of my own life, which I experienced when I sucked the blood from Lestat's wrist and felt his heart pound with my heart. It is again and again a celebration of that experience, because for vampires, that is the ultimate experience. He said this most seriously, as if he were arguing with someone who held a different view. I don't think Lestat ever appreciated that, though how he could not, I don't know. Let me say he appreciated something, but very little, I think, of what there is to know. In any event, he took no pains to remind me now of what I'd felt when I clamped onto his wrist for life itself and wouldn't let it go, or to pick and choose a place for me where I might experience my first kill with some measure of quiet and dignity. He rushed headlong through the encounter as if it were something to put behind us as quickly as possible. Like so many yards of the road, once he had caught the slave, he gagged him and held him, baring his neck. "Do it!" he said. "You can't turn back now." Overcome with revulsion and weak with frustration, I obeyed. I knelt beside the bent, struggling man, and clamping both my hands on his shoulders, I went into his neck. My teeth had only just begun to change, and I had to tear his flesh, not puncture it. But once the wound was made, the blood flowed. And once that happened, once I was locked to it, drinking, all else vanished. Lestat and the swamp and the noise of the distant camp meant nothing. Lestat might have been an insect buzzing, lighting, then vanishing in significance. The sucking mesmerized me. The warm struggling of the man was soothing to the tension of my hands. And there came the beating of the drum again, which was the drumbeat of his heart. Only this time it beat in perfect rhythm with the drumbeat of my own heart, the two resounding in every fiber of my being until the beat began to grow slower and slower, so that each was a soft rumble that threatened to go on without end. I was drowsing, falling into weightlessness, and then Lestat pulled me back. "He's dead, you idiot," he said with his characteristic charm and tact. "You don't drink after they're dead. Understand that." I was in a frenzy for a moment, not myself, insisting to him that the man's heart still beat, and I was in an agony to clamp onto him again. I ran my hands over his chest, then grabbed at his wrists. I would have cut into his wrist if Lestat hadn't pulled me to my feet and slapped my face. This slap was astonishing. It was not painful in the ordinary way. It was a sensational shock of another sort, a rapping of the senses, so that I spun in confusion and found myself helpless and staring, my back against a cypress, the night pulsing with insects in my ears. "You'll die if you do that," Lestat was saying. "He'll suck you right down into death with him if you cling to him in death. And now you've drunk too much besides. You'll be ill." His voice grated on me. I had the urge to throw myself on him suddenly, but I was feeling just what he'd said. There was a grinding pain in my stomach, as if some whirlpool there were sucking my insides into itself. It was the blood passing too rapidly into my own blood. But I didn't know it. Lestat moved through the night now like a cat, and I followed him, my head throbbing, this pain in my stomach no better when we reached the house of Pointe du Lac. As we sat at the table in the parlor, Lestat dealing a game of solitaire on the polished wood, I sat there staring at him with contempt. He was mumbling nonsense. "I would get used to killing," he said. "It would be nothing. I must not allow myself to be shaken. I was reacting too much, as if the mortal coil had not been shaken off. I would become accustomed to things all too quickly." "Do you think so?" I asked him finally. I really had no interest in his answer. I understood now the difference between us. For me, the experience of killing had been cataclysmic. So had that of sucking Lestat's wrist. These experiences so overwhelmed and so changed my view of everything around me, from the picture of my brother on the parlor wall to the sight of a single star in the topmost pane of the French window, that I could not imagine another vampire taking them for granted. I was altered, permanently. I knew it. And what I felt most profoundly for everything, even the sound of the playing cards being laid down one by one upon the shining rows of the solitaire, was respect. Lestat felt the opposite, or he felt nothing. He was the sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made. As boring as a mortal, as trivial and unhappy as a mortal, he chatted over the game, belittling my experience, utterly locked against the possibility of any experience of his own. By morning I realized that I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher. He must guide me through the necessary lessons, if there were any more real lessons, and I must tolerate in him a frame of mind which was blasphemous to life itself. I felt cold towards him. I had no contempt and superiority, only a hunger for new experience, for that which was beautiful and as devastating as my kill. And I saw that if I were to maximize every experience available to me, I must exert my own powers over my learning. Lestat was of no use. It was well past midnight when I finally rose out of the chair and went out on the gallery. The moon was large over the cypresses, and the candlelight poured from the open doors. The thick plastered pillars and walls of the house had been freshly whitewashed, the floorboards freshly swept, and a summer rain had left the night clean and sparkling with drops of water. I leaned against the end pillar of the gallery, my head touching the soft tendrils of a jasmine which grew there in constant battle with the wisteria, and I thought of what lay before me throughout the world and throughout time, and resolved to go about it delicately and reverently, learning that from each thing which would take me best to another. What this meant, I wasn't sure myself. Do you understand me when I say I did not wish to rush headlong into experience, that what I'd felt as a vampire was far too powerful to be wasted? Yes, said the boy eagerly. It sounds as if it was like being in love. The vampire's eyes gleamed. That's correct. It is like love, he smiled. And I tell you, my frame of mind that night, so you can know there are profound differences between vampires and how I came to take a different approach from Lestat, you must understand I did not snub him because he did not appreciate his experience. I simply could not understand how such feelings could be wasted. But then Lestat did something which was to show me a way to go about my learning. He had more than a casual appreciation of the wealth at Pointe du Lac. He'd been much pleased by the beauty of the china used for his father's supper, and he liked the feel of the velvet drapes, and he traced the patterns of the carpets with his toe. And now he took from one of the china closets a crystal glass and said, I do miss glasses, only he said this with an impish delight that caused me to study him with a hard eye. I disliked him intensely. I want to show you a little trick, he said. That is, if you like glasses. And after setting it on the card table, he came out on the gallery where I stood and changed his manner again into that of a stalking animal, eyes piercing the dark beyond the lights of the house, peering down under the arching branches of the oaks. In an instant he had vaulted the railing and dropped softly on the dirt below, and then lunged into the blackness to catch something in both his hands. When he stood before me with it, I gasped to see it was a rat. Don't be such a damned idiot, he said. Haven't you ever seen a rat? It was a huge, struggling field rat with a long tail. He held its neck so it couldn't bite. Rats can be quite nice, he said. And he took the rat to the wine glass, slashed its throat, and filled the glass rapidly with blood. The rat then went hurtling over the gallery railing, and Lestat held the wine glass to the candle triumphantly. You may well have to live off rats from time to time, so wipe that expression off your face, he said. Rats, chickens, cattle. Traveling by ship, you damn well better live off rats if you don't wish to cause such a panic on board that they search your coffin. You damn well better keep the ship clean of rats. And then he sipped the blood as delicately as if it were burgundy. He made a slight face. It gets cold so fast. Do you mean, then, we can live from animals? I asked. Yes. He drank it all down and then casually threw the glass at the fireplace. I stared at the fragments. You don't mind, do you? He gestured to the broken glass with a sarcastic smile. I surely hope you don't, because there's nothing much you can do about it if you do mind. I can throw you and your father out of Pointe du Lac if I mind, I said. I believe this was my first show of temper. Why would you do that? He asked with mock alarm. You don't know everything yet, do you? He was laughing then and walking slowly about the room. He ran his fingers over the satin finish of the spinet. Do you play? He asked. I said something like, don't touch it. And he laughed at me. I'll touch it if I like, he said. You don't know, for example, all the ways you can die. And dying now would be such a calamity, wouldn't it? There must be someone else in the world to teach me these things, I said. Certainly you're not the only vampire. And your father, he's perhaps 70. You couldn't have been a vampire long. So someone must have instructed you. And do you think you can find other vampires by yourself? They might see you coming, my friend, but you won't see them. No, I don't think you have much choice about things at this point, friend. I'm your teacher, and you need me, and there isn't much you can do about it either way. And we both have people to provide for. My father needs a doctor, and then there is the matter of your mother and sister. Don't get any mortal notions about telling them you are a vampire. Just provide for them and for my father, which means that tomorrow night you had better kill fast and then attend to the business of your plantation. Now to bed. We both sleep in the same room. It makes for far less risk. No, you secure the bedroom for yourself, I said. I've no intention of staying in the same room with you. He became furious. Don't do anything stupid, Louis. I warn you. There's nothing you can do to defend yourself once the sun rises. Nothing. Separate rooms mean separate security, double precautions, and double chance of notice. He then said a score of things to frighten me into complying, but he might as well have been talking to the walls. I watched him intently, but I didn't listen to him. He appeared frail and stupid to me, a man made of dry twigs with a thin, carping voice. "I sleep alone," I said, and gently put my hand around the candle flames one by one. "It's almost morning," he insisted. "So lock yourself in," I said, embracing my coffin, hoisting it and carrying it down the brick stairs. I could hear the lock snapping on the French doors above, the swoosh of the drapes. The sky was pale but still sprinkled with stars, and another light rain blew now on the breeze from the river, speckling the flagstones. I opened the door of my brother's oratory, shoving back the roses and thorns, which had almost sealed it, and set the coffin on the stone floor before the prie-dieu. I could almost make out the images of the saints on the walls. "Paul," I said softly, addressing my brother, "for the first time in my life, I feel nothing for you, nothing for your death, and for the first time I feel everything for you. Feel the sorrow of your loss as I never before knew the feeling. You see," the vampire turned to the boy. "For the first time now I was fully and completely a vampire. I shut the wood blinds flat upon the small barred windows and bolted the door. Then I climbed into the satin-lined coffin, barely able to see the gleam of cloth in the darkness, and locked myself in. This is how I became a vampire." "And there you were," said the boy after a pause, "with another vampire you hated." "But I had to stay with him," answered the vampire. "As I've told you, he had me at a great disadvantage. He hinted there was much I didn't know and must know, and that he alone could tell me. But in fact, the main part of what he did teach me was practical, and not so difficult to figure out for oneself. How we might travel, for instance, by ship, having our coffins transported for us as though they contained the remains of loved ones, being sent here or there for burial, how no one would dare to open such a coffin, and we might rise from it at night to clean the ship of rats. Things of this nature. And then there were the shops and businessmen he knew who admitted us well after hours to outfit us in the finest Paris fashions, and those agents willing to transact financial matters in restaurants and cabarets. And in all of these mundane matters, Lestat was an adequate teacher. What manner of man he'd been in life I couldn't tell and didn't care, but he was for all appearances of the same class now as myself, which meant little to me except that it made our lives run a little more smoothly than they might have otherwise. He had impeccable taste, though my library to him was a pile of dust, and he seemed more than once to be infuriated by the sight of my reading a book or writing some observations in a journal. "That mortal nonsense," he would say to me, while at the same time spending so much of my money to splendidly furnish Pointe du Lac that even I, who cared nothing for the money, was forced to wince. And in entertaining visitors at Pointe du Lac, those hapless travelers who came up the river road by horseback or carriage, begging accommodations for the night, sporting letters of introduction from other planters or officials in New Orleans, to these he was so gentle and polite that it made things far easier for me, who found myself hopelessly locked to him and jarred over and over by his viciousness. "But he didn't harm these men?" asked the boy. "Oh, yes. Often he did, but I'll tell you a little secret, if I may, which applies not only to vampires, but to generals, soldiers, and kings. Most of us would much rather see somebody die than be the object of rudeness under our roofs. Strange, yes, but very true, I assure you, that Lestat hunted for mortals every night, I knew. But had he been savage and ugly to my family, my guests, and my slaves, I couldn't have endured it. He was not. He seemed particularly to delight in the visitors, but he said we must spare no expense where our families were concerned. And he seemed to push luxury upon his father to an almost ludicrous point. The old blind man must be told constantly how fine and expensive were his bed jackets and robes, and what imported draperies had just been fixed to his bed, and what French and Spanish wines we had in the cellar, and how much the plantation yielded even in bad years, when the coast talked of abandoning the indigo production altogether and going into sugar. But then at other times he would bully the old man, as I mentioned. He would erupt into such rage that the old man whimpered like a child. "Don't I take care of you in baronial splendor?" Lestat would shout at him. "Don't I provide for your every want? Stop whining to me about going to church or old friends. Such nonsense. Your old friends are dead. Why don't you die and leave me and my bankroll in peace?" The old man would cry softly that these things meant so little to him in old age. He would have been content on his little farm forever. I wanted often to ask him later, where was this farm? From where did you come to Louisiana? To get some clue to that place where Lestat might have known another vampire. But I didn't dare to bring these things up, lest the old man start crying and Lestat become enraged. But these fits were no more frequent than periods of near obsequious kindness, when Lestat would bring his father's supper on a tray, and feed him patiently while talking of the weather and the New Orleans news and the activities of my mother and sister. It was obvious that a great gulf existed between father and son, both in education and refinement, but how it came about I could not quite guess, and from this whole matter I achieved a somewhat consistent detachment. Existence, as I've said, was possible. There was always the promise behind his mocking smile, that he knew great things or terrible things, had commerce with levels of darkness I could not possibly guess at. And all the time he belittled me and attacked me for my love of the senses, my reluctance to kill, and the near swoon which killing could produce in me. He laughed uproariously when I discovered that I could see myself in a mirror, and that crosses had no effect upon me, and would taunt me with sealed lips when I asked about God or the devil. I'd like to meet the devil some night, he said once with a malignant smile. I'd chase him from here to the wilds of the Pacific. I am the devil. And when I was aghast at this, he went into peals of laughter. What happened was simply that in my distaste for him, I came to ignore and suspect him, and yet to study him with a detached fascination. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at his wrist from which I'd drawn my vampire life, and I would fall into such a stillness that my mind seemed to leave my body, or rather my body to become my mind, and then he would see me and stare at me with a stubborn ignorance of what I felt and longed to know, and reaching over, shake me roughly out of it. I bore this with an overt detachment unknown to me in mortal life, and came to understand this as a part of vampire nature, that I might sit at home at Point du Lac and think for hours of my brother's mortal life, and see it short and rounded in unfathomable darkness, understanding now the vain and senseless wasting passion with which I'd mourned his loss, and turned on other mortals like a maddened animal. All that confusion was then like dancers frenzied in a fog, and now in the strange vampire nature, I felt a profound sadness. But I did not brood over this. Let me not give you that impression, for brooding would have been to me the most terrible waste, but rather I looked around me at all the mortals that I knew, and saw all life as precious, condemning all fruitless guilt and passion that would let it slip through the fingers like sand. It was only now as a vampire that I did come to know my sister, forbidding her the plantation for the city life which she so needed in order to know her own time of life and her own beauty, and come to marry, not brood for our lost brother and my going away, or become a nursemaid for our mother, and I provided for them all they might need or want, finding even the most trivial request worth my immediate attention. My sister laughed at the transformation in me when we would meet at night, and I would take her from our flat out the narrow wooden streets to walk along the tree-lined levee in the moonlight, savoring the orange blossoms and the caressing warmth, talking for hours of her most secret thoughts and dreams, those little fantasies she dared to tell no one, and would even whisper to me when we sat in the dim-lit parlor entirely alone. And I would see her sweet and palpable before me, a shimmering precious creature, soon to grow old, soon to die, soon to lose these moments that in their tangibility promised to us wrongly, an immortality, as if it were our very birthright, which we could not come to grasp the meaning of until this time of middle life, when we looked only on as many years ahead as already lay behind us, when every moment must be first known and then savored. It was detachment that made this possible, a sublime loneliness with which Lestat and I moved through the world of mortal men, and all material troubles passed from us. I should tell you the practical nature of it. Lestat had always known how to steal from victims chosen for sumptuous dress and other promising signs of extravagance, but the great problems of shelter and secrecy had been for him a terrible struggle. I suspected that beneath his gentleman's veneer he was painfully ignorant of the most simple financial matters. But I was not, and so he could acquire cash at any moment, and I could invest it. If he were not picking the pocket of a dead man in an alley, he was at the greatest gambling tables in the richest salons of the city, using his vampire keenness to suck gold and dollars and deeds of property from young planters' sons who found him deceptive in his friendship and alluring in his charm. But this had never given him the life he wanted, and so for that he had ushered me into the preternatural world that he might acquire an investor and manager for whom these skills of mortal life became most valuable in this life after. But let me describe New Orleans as it was then, and as it was to become, so you can understand how simple our lives were. There was no city in America like New Orleans. It was filled not only with the French and Spanish of all classes, who had formed in part its peculiar aristocracy, but later with immigrants of all kinds, the Irish and the German in particular. Then there were not only the black slaves, yet unhomogenized and fantastical in their different tribal garb and manners, but the great growing class of the free people of color, those marvelous people of our mixed blood and that of the islands who produced a magnificent and unique caste of craftsmen, artists, poets, and renowned feminine beauty. And then there were the Indians who covered the levee on summer days selling herbs and crafted wares. And drifting through this medley of language and colors were the people of the port, the sailors of ships who came in great waves to spend their money in the cabarets, to buy for the night the beautiful women, both dark and light, to dine on the best of Spanish and French cooking and drink the imported wines of the world. Then add to these, within years after my transformation, the Americans who built the city upriver from the old French quarter with magnificent Grecian houses which gleamed in the moonlight like temples. And of course, the planters. Always the planters, coming to town with their families in shining landaus to buy evening gowns and silver and gems, to crowd the narrow streets on the way to the old French Opera House, and the Theatre d'Orleans and the St. Louis Cathedral, from whose open doors came the chants of High Mass, over the crowds of the Place d'Armes on Sundays, over the noise and bickering of the French market, over the silent ghostly drift of the ships along the raised waters of the Mississippi, which flowed against the levee above the ground of New Orleans itself, so that the ships appeared to float against the sky. This was New Orleans, a magical and magnificent place to live, in which a vampire, richly dressed and gracefully walking through the pools of light of one gas lamp after another, might attract no more notice in the evening than hundreds of other exotic creatures. If he attracted any at all, if anyone stopped to whisper behind a fan, "That man, how pale, how he gleams, how he moves, it's not natural!" A city in which a vampire might be gone before the words had even passed the lips, seeking out the alleys in which he could see like a cat the darkened bars in which sailors slept with their heads on the table. Great high-ceilinged hotel rooms where a lone figure might sit, her feet upon an embroidered cushion, her legs covered with a lace counterpane, her head bent under the tarnished light of a single candle, never seeing the great shadow move across the plaster flowers of the ceiling, never seeing the long white finger reach to press the fragile flame. Remarkable, if not for nothing else, because of this, that all of those men and women who stayed for any reason left behind them some monument, some structure of marble and brick and stone that still stands, so that even when the gas lamps went out and the planes came in and the office buildings crowded the blocks of Canal Street, something irreducible of beauty and romance remained. Not in every street perhaps, but in so many that the landscape is for me the landscape of those times always, and walking now in the starlit streets of the Quarter or the Garden District, I am in those times again. I suppose that is the nature of the monument, be it a small house or a mansion of Corinthian columns and wrought iron lace. The monument does not say that this or that man walked here. No, that what he felt in one time and one spot continues. The moon that rose over New Orleans then still rises. As long as the monument stands, it still rises. The feeling, at least here and there, it remains the same. The vampire appeared sad. He sighed, as if he doubted what he had just said. What was it, he asked suddenly, as if he were slightly tired. Yes, money. Lestat and I had to make money. And I was telling you that he could steal, but it was investment afterwards that mattered. What we accumulated we must use, but I go ahead of myself. I killed animals. But I'll get to that in a moment. Lestat killed humans all the time, sometimes 2 or 3 a night, sometimes more. He would drink from one just enough to satisfy a momentary thirst, and then go on to another. The better the human, as he would say in his vulgar way, the more he liked it. A fresh young girl, that was his favorite food the first of the evening. But the triumphant kill for Lestat was a young man. A young man around your age would have appealed to him in particular. Me? The boy whispered. He had leaned forward on his elbows to peer into the vampire's eyes, and now he drew up. Yes, the vampire went on, as if he hadn't observed the boy's change of expression. You see, they represented the greatest loss to Lestat, because they stood on the threshold of the maximum possibility of life. Of course, Lestat didn't understand this himself. I came to understand it. Lestat understood nothing. I shall give you a perfect example of what Lestat liked. Up the river from us was the Frenière plantation, a magnificent spread of land which had great hopes of making a fortune in sugar, just shortly after the refining process had been invented. I presume you know sugar was refined in Louisiana. There is something perfect and ironic about it. This land which I love producing refined sugar. I mean this more unhappily than I think you know. This refined sugar is a poison. It was like the essence of life in New Orleans, so sweet that it can be fatal, so richly enticing that all other values are forgotten. But as I was saying, upriver from us lived the Frenières, a great old French family which had produced in this generation 5 young women and 1 young man. Now, 3 of the young women were destined not to marry, but 2 were young enough still, and all depended upon the young man. He was to manage the plantation as I had done for my mother and sister. He was to negotiate marriages, to put together dowries when the entire fortune of the place rode precariously on the next year's sugar crop. He was to bargain, fight, and keep at a distance the entire material world for the world of Frenières. Lestat decided he wanted him, and when fate alone nearly cheated Lestat, he went wild. He risked his own life to get the Frenière boy, who had become involved in a duel. He had insulted a young Spanish Creole at a ball. The whole thing was nothing really, but like most young Creoles, this one was willing to die for nothing. They were both willing to die for nothing. The Frenière household was in an uproar. You must understand, Lestat knew this perfectly. Both of us had hunted the Frenière plantation. Lestat for slaves and chicken thieves, and me for animals. You were only killing animals. Yes, but I'll come to that later, as I said. We both knew the plantation, and I had indulged in one of the greatest pleasures of a vampire, that of watching people unbeknownst to them. I knew the Frenière sister as I knew the magnificent rose trees around my brother's oratory. They were a unique group of women, each in her own way as smart as a brother. And one of them, I shall call her Babette, was not only as smart as her brother, but far wiser. Yet none had been educated to care for the plantation. None understood even the simplest facts about its financial state. All were totally dependent upon young Frenière, and all knew it. And so, larded with their love for him, their passionate belief that he hung the moon, and that any conjugal love they might ever know would only be a pale reflection of their love for him, larded with this was a desperation as strong as the will to survive. If Frenière died in the duel, the plantation would collapse. Its fragile economy, a life of splendor based on the perennial mortgaging of the next year's crop, was in his hands alone. So you can imagine the panic and misery in the Frenière household the night that the son went to town to fight the appointed duel. And now picture Lestat, gnashing his teeth like a comic opera devil because he was not going to kill the young Frenière. You mean then that you felt for the Frenière women? I felt for them totally, said the vampire. Their position was agonizing, and I felt for the boy. That night he locked himself in his father's study and made a will. He knew full well that if he fell under the rapier at 4 a.m. the next morning, his family would fall with him. He deplored his situation and yet could do nothing to help it. To run out on the duel would not only mean social ruin for him, but would probably have been impossible. The other young man would have pursued him until he was forced to fight. When he left the plantation at midnight, he was staring to the face of death itself with the character of a man who, having only one path to follow, has resolved to follow with perfect courage. He would either kill the Spanish boy or die. It was unpredictable, despite all his skill. His face reflected a depth of feeling and wisdom I'd never seen on the face of any of Lestat's struggling victims. I had my first battle with Lestat then and there. I prevented him from killing the boy for months, and now he meant to kill him before the Spanish boy could. We were on horseback, racing after the young Frenière towards New Orleans. Lestat bent on overtaking him. I bent on overtaking Lestat. Well, the duel, as I told you, was scheduled for 4 a.m. on the edge of the swamp just beyond the city's northern gate. And arriving there just shortly before 4, we had precious little time to return to Pointe du Lac, which meant our own lives were in danger. I was incensed at Lestat as never before. He was determined to get the boy. Give him his chance, I was insisting, getting hold of Lestat before he could approach. The boy was midwinter, bitter cold and damp in the swamps. One volley of icy rain after another, sweeping the clearing where the duel was to be fought. Of course, I did not fear these elements in the sense that you might. They did not numb me, nor threaten me with mortal shivering or illness, but vampires feel cold as acutely as humans, and the blood of the kill is often the rich, sensual alleviation of that cold. But what concerned me that morning was not the pain I felt, but the excellent cover of darkness these elements provided, which made Frenière extremely vulnerable to Lestat's attack. All he need do would be step away from his 2 friends towards the swamp, and Lestat might take him. And so I physically grappled with Lestat. I held him. But towards all this you had detachment, distance? The vampire sighed. Yes, I had it, and with it a supremely resolute anger. To glut himself upon the life of an entire family was to me Lestat's supreme act of utter contempt, and disregard for all he should have seen with a vampire's depth. So I held him in the dark where he spit at me and cursed at me, and young Frenière took his rapier from his friend and Sekinen went out on the slick, wet grass to meet his opponent. There was a brief conversation, then the duel commenced. In moments it was over. Frenier had mortally wounded the other boy with a swift thrust to the chest, and he knelt in the grass, bleeding, dying, shouting something unintelligible at Frenier. The victor simply stood there. Everyone could see there was no sweetness in the victory. Frenier looked on death as if it were an abomination. His companions advanced with their lanterns, urging him to come away as soon as possible and leave the dying man to his friends. Meanwhile, the wounded one would allow no one to touch him, and then, as Frenier's group turned to go, the three of them walking heavily towards their horses, the man on the ground drew a pistol. Perhaps I alone could see this in the powerful dark, but in any event, I shouted to Frenier as I ran towards the gun, and this was all that Lestat needed. While I was lost in my clumsiness, distracting Frenier, and going for the gun itself, Lestat, with his years of experience and superior speed, grabbed the young man and spirited him into the cypresses. I doubt his friends even knew what had happened. The pistol had gone off, the wounded man had collapsed, and I was tearing through the near-frozen marshes, shouting for Lestat. Then I saw him. Frenier lay sprawled over the knobbed roots of a cypress, his boots deep in the murky water, and Lestat was still bent over him, one hand on the hand of Frenier that still held the foil. I went to pull Lestat off, and that right hand swung at me with such lightning speed I did not see it, did not know it had struck me until I found myself in the water also. And of course, by the time I recovered, Frenier was dead. I saw him as he lay there, his eyes closed, his lips utterly still as if he were just sleeping. Damn you, I began, cursing Lestat, and then I started, for the body of Frenier had begun to slip down into the marsh. The water rose over his face and covered him completely. Lestat was jubilant. He reminded me, Teresa, that we had less than an hour to get back to Pointe du Lac, and he swore revenge on me. If I didn't like the life of a southern planter, I'd finish you tonight. I know a way, he threatened me. I ought to drive your horse into the swamps. You'd have to dig yourself a hole and smother. He rode off. Even over all these years, I feel that anger for him like a white-hot liquid filling my veins. I saw them what being a vampire meant to him. He was just a killer, the boy said, his voice reflecting some of the vampire's emotion. No regard for anything. No, being a vampire for him meant revenge. Revenge against life itself. Every time he took a life, it was revenge. It was no wonder then that he appreciated nothing. The nuances of vampire existence weren't even available to him because he was focused with a maniacal vengeance upon the mortal life he'd left. Consumed with hatred, he looked back. Consumed with envy, nothing pleased him unless he could take it from others, and once having it, he grew cold and dissatisfied, not loving the thing for itself, and so he went after something else, vengeance, blind and sterile and contemptible. But I've spoken to you about the Frenier sisters. It was almost 5:30 when I reached their plantation. Dawn would come shortly after 6, but I was almost home. I slipped onto the upper gallery of their house and saw them all gathered in the parlor. They had never even dressed for bed. The candles burnt low, and they sat, all ready as mourners, waiting for the word. They were all dressed in black, as was their at-home custom, and in the dark, the black shapes of their dresses massed together with their raven hair, so that in the glow of the candles their faces appeared as 5 soft, shimmering apparitions, each uniquely sad, each uniquely courageous. Babette's face alone appeared resolute. It was as if she had already made up her mind to take the burdens of Frenier if her brother died, and she had that same expression on her face now which had been on our brother's when he mounted to leave for the duel. What lay ahead of her was nearly impossible. What lay ahead was the final death of which Lestat was guilty. So I did something then which caused me great risk. I made myself known to her. I did this by playing the light. As you can see, my face is very white and has a smooth, highly reflective surface, rather like that of polished marble. Yes, the boy nodded and appeared flustered. It's very beautiful, actually, said the boy. I wonder if... But what happened? You wonder if I was a handsome man when I was alive, said the vampire. The boy nodded. I was. Nothing structurally has changed in me, only I never knew that I was handsome. Life whirled about me a wind of petty concerns, as I've said. I gazed at nothing, not even a mirror, especially not a mirror, with a free eye. But this is what happened. I stepped near to the pane of glass and let the light touch my face. And this I did at a moment when Babette's eyes were turned towards the panes. Then I appropriately vanished. Within seconds, all the sisters knew a strange creature had been seen, a ghost-like creature, and the 2 slave maids steadfastly refused to investigate. I waited out these moments impatiently for just that which I wanted to happen. Babette finally took a candelabrum from a side table, lit the candles, and scoring everyone's fear, ventured out onto the cold gallery, alone to see what was there. Her sisters hovering in the door like great black birds, one of them crying that the brother was dead and she had indeed seen his ghost. Of course, you must understand that Babette, being as strong as she was, never once attributed what she saw to imagination or to ghosts. I let her come the length of the dark gallery before I spoke to her, and even then I let her see only the vague outline of my body beside one of the columns. "Tell your sisters to go back," I whispered to her. "I come to tell you of your brother. Do as I say." She was still for an instant, and then she turned to me and strained to see me in the dark. "I have only a little time." "I would not harm you for the world," I said, and she obeyed. Saying it was nothing, she told him to shut the door, and they obeyed as people obey who not only need a leader, but are desperate for one. Then I stepped into the light of Babette's candles. The boy's eyes were wide. He put his hand to his lips. "Did you look to her as you do to me?" he asked. "You ask that with such innocence," said the vampire. "Yes, I suppose I certainly did. Only by candlelight I always had a less supernatural appearance, and I made no pretense with her of being an ordinary creature. I have only minutes," I told her at once, "but what I have to tell you is of the greatest importance. Your brother fought bravely and won the duel, but wait. You must know now he is dead. Death was proverbial with him. The thief in the night about which all his goodness or courage could do nothing. But this is not the principal thing, which I came to tell you. It is this. You can rule the plantation and you can save it. All that is required is that you let no one convince you otherwise. You must assume his position despite any outcry, any talk of convention, any talk of propriety or common sense. You must listen to nothing. The same land is here now that was here yesterday. Morning when your brother slept above, nothing is changed. You must take his place. If you do not, the land is lost and the family is lost. You will be 5 women on a small pension, doomed to live but half or less of what life could give you. Learn what you must know. Stop at nothing until you have the answers. And take my visitation to you to be your courage whenever you waver. You must take the reins of your own life. Your brother is dead." I could see by her face that she had heard every word. She would have questioned me had there been time, but she believed me when I said there was not. Then I used all my skill to leave her, so swiftly I appeared to vanish. From the garden I saw her face above in the glow of her candles. I saw her search the dark for me, turning around and around, and then I saw her make the sign of the cross and walk back to her sisters within. The vampire smiled. There was absolutely no talk on the river coast of any strange apparition to Babette Première, but after the first mourning and sad talk of the women left all alone, she became the scandal of the neighborhood because she chose to run the plantation on her own. She managed an immense dowry for her younger sister and was married herself in another year, and Lestat and I almost never exchanged words. Did he go on living at Pointe du Lac? Yes, I could not be certain he told me all I needed to know, and great pretense was necessary. My sister was married in my absence, for example, while I had a malarial chill, and something similar overcame me the morning of my mother's funeral. Meantime, Lestat and I sat down to dinner each night with the old man, and made nice noises with our knives and forks while he told us to eat everything on our plates, and not to drink our wine too fast. With dozens of miserable headaches, I would receive my sister in a darkened bedroom, the covers up to my chin, bid her and her husband bear with the dim light on account of the pain in my eyes, as I entrusted to them large amounts of money to invest for us all. Fortunately, her husband was an idiot, a harmless one, but an idiot, the product of 4 generations of marriages between first cousins. But though these things went well, we began to have our problems with the slaves. They were the suspicious ones, and as I've indicated, Lestat killed anyone and everyone he chose, so there was always some talk of mysterious death on the part of the coast. But it was what they saw of us which began the talk, and I heard it one evening when I was playing a shadow about the slave cabins. Now, let me explain first the character of these slaves. It was only about 1795. Lestat and I having lived there for 4 years in relative quiet, I investing the money which he acquired, increasing our lands, purchasing apartments and townhouses in New Orleans, which I rented, the work of the plantation itself producing little more a cover for us than an investment. I say our, this is wrong. I never signed anything over to Lestat, and as you realize, I was still legally alive, but in 1795, these slaves did not have the character which you've seen in films and novels of the South. They were not soft-spoken, brown-skinned people in drab rags who spoke an English dialect. They were Africans, and they were islanders, that is, some of them had come from Santo Domingo. They were very black and totally foreign. They spoke in their African tongues, and they spoke the French patois. And when they sang African songs which made the fields exotic and strange, always frightening to me in my mortal life. They were superstitious, and had their own secrets and traditions. In short, they had not yet been destroyed as Africans completely. Slavery was the curse of their existence, but they had not yet been robbed yet of that which had been characteristically theirs. They tolerated the baptism in modest garments imposed on them by the French Catholic laws, but in the evenings they made their cheap fabrics into alluring costumes, made of jewelry of animal bones and bits of discarded metal, which they polished to look like gold. And the slave cabins of Pointe du Lac were a foreign country, an African coast after dark in which not even the coldest overseer would want to wander. No fear for the vampire. Not until one summer evening, when passing for a shadow, I heard through the open doors of the black foreman's cottage a conversation which convinced me that Lestat and I slept in real danger. The slaves knew now we were not ordinary mortals. In hushed tones the maids told of how, through a crack in the door, they had seen us dine on empty plates with empty silver, lifting empty glasses to our lips, laughing, our faces bleached and ghostly in the candlelight, the blind man a helpless fool in our power. Through keyholes they had seen Lestat's coffin, and once he had beaten one of them mercilessly for dawdling by the gallery windows of his room. "There is no bed in there," they confided one to the other with nodding heads. "He sleeps in the coffin. I know it." They were convinced on the best of grounds of what we were. And as for me, they'd seen me evening after evening emerge from the oratory, which was now little more than a shapeless mass of brick and vine, layered with flowering wisteria in the spring, wild roses in summer, moss gleaming on the old unpainted shutters which had never been opened, spiders spinning in the stone arches. Of course, I pretended to visit it in memory of Paul, but it was clear by their speech they no longer believed such lies. And now they attributed to us not only the death of slaves found in the fields and swamps, and also the dead cattle and occasional horses, but all other strange events. Even floods and thunder were the weapons of God in a personal battle waged with Louis and Lestat. But worse still, they were not planning to run away. We were devils, our power inescapable. No, we must be destroyed. And at this gathering, where I became an unseen member, were a number of the Frenier slaves. This meant word would get to the entire coast. And though I firmly believed the entire coast to be impervious to a wave of hysteria, I did not intend to risk notice of any kind. I hurried back to the plantation house to tell Lestat our game of playing planter was over. He'd have to give up his slave whip and golden napkin ring and move into town. He resisted. Naturally, his father was gravely ill and might not live. He had no intention of running away from stupid slaves. "I'll kill them all," he said calmly, "in 3s and 4s. Some will run away and that will be fine." "You're talking madness. The fact is, I want you gone from here." "You want me gone? You?" he sneered. He was building a card palace on the dining room table with a pack of very fine French cards. "You whining coward of a vampire who prowls the night, killing alley cats and rats and staring for hours at candles as if they were people, and standing in the rain like a zombie until your clothes are drenched and you smell like old wardrobe trunks and attics and have the look of a baffled idiot at the zoo. You've nothing more to tell me, and your insistence on recklessness has endangered us both. I might live in that oratory alone while this house fell to ruin. I don't care about it," I told him, because this was quite true. "But you must have all the things you never had of life and make of immortality a junk shop in which both of us become grotesque. Now go look at your father and tell me how long he has to live, for that's how long you stay, and only if the slaves don't rise up against us." He told me then to go look at his father myself, since I was the one who was always looking, and I did. The old man was truly dying. I had been spared my mother's death more or less because she had died very suddenly on an afternoon. She'd been found with her sewing basket, seated quietly in the courtyard. She had died as one goes to sleep. But now I was seeing a natural death that was too slow with agony and with consciousness. And I'd always liked the old man. He was kindly and simple and made few demands. By day he sat in the sun of the gallery dozing and listening to the birds. By night any chatter on our part kept him company. He could play chess, carefully feeling each piece and remembering the entire state of the board with remarkable accuracy. And though Lestat would never play with him, I did often. Now he lay gasping for breath, his forehead hot and wet, the pillow around him stained with sweat. And as he moaned and prayed for death, Lestat in the other room began to play the spinet. I slammed it shut, barely missing his fingers. "You won't play while he dies," I said. "The hell I won't," he answered me. "I'll play the drum if I like." And taking a great sterling silver platter from a sideboard, he slipped a finger through one of its handles and beat it with a spoon. I told him to stop it or I would make him stop it, and then we both ceased our noise because the old man was calling his name. He was saying that he must talk to Lestat now before he died. I told Lestat to go to him. The sound of his crying was terrible. "Why should I? I've cared for him all these years." "Isn't that enough?" and he drew from his pocket a nail file, and seating himself on the foot of the old man's bed, he began to file his long nails. Meantime, I should tell you that I was aware of slaves about the house. They were watching and listening. I was truly hoping the old man would die within minutes. Once or twice before I dealt with suspicion or doubt on the part of several slaves, but never such a number. I immediately rang for Daniel, the slave to whom I had given the overseer's house and position. But while I waited for him, I could hear the old man talking to Lestat. Lestat, who sat with his legs crossed, filing and filing, one eyebrow arched, his attention on his perfect nails. It was the school, the old man was saying. Oh, I know you remember. What can I say to you? He moaned. You'd better say it, Lestat said, because you're about to die. The old man let out a terrible noise, and I suspect I made some sound of my own. I positively loathed Lestat. I had a mind now to get him out of the room. Well, you know that, don't you? Even a fool like you knows that, said Lestat. You'll never forgive me, will you? Not now, not even after I'm dead, said the old man. I don't know what you're talking about, said Lestat. My patience was becoming exhausted with him, and the old man was becoming more and more agitated. He was begging Lestat to listen to him with a warm heart. The whole thing was making me shudder. Meantime, Daniel had come, and I knew the moment I saw him that everything at Pointe du Lac was lost. Had I been more attentive, I'd have seen signs of it before now. He looked at me with eyes of glass. I was a monster to him. Monsieur Lestat's father is very ill, I said, ignoring his expression. I want no noise tonight. The slaves must all stay within the cabins. A doctor is on his way. He stared at me as if I were lying, and then his eyes moved curiously and coldly away from me towards the old man's door. His face underwent such a change that I rose at once and looked in the room. It was Lestat, slouched at the foot of the bed, his back to the bedpost, his nail file working furiously, grimacing in such a way that both his great teeth showed prominently. The vampire stopped, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. He was looking at the boy, and the boy looked shyly at the table, but he had already looked, and fixedly at the vampire's mouth. He had seen that the lips were of a different texture from the vampire's skin, that they were silken and delicately lined like any person's lips, only deadly white, and he had glimpsed the white teeth, only the vampire had such a way of smiling that they were not completely revealed, and the boy had not even thought of such teeth until now. You can imagine, said the vampire, what this meant. I had to kill him. You what? Said the boy. I had to kill him. He started to run. He would have alarmed everyone. Perhaps it might have been handled some other way, but I had no time. So I went after him, overpowering him, but then, finding myself in the act of doing what I had not done for 4 years, I stopped. This was a man. He had his bone-handled knife in his hand to defend himself, and I took it from him easily and slipped it into his heart. He sank to his knees at once, his fingers tightening on the blade, bleeding on it. And the sight of the blood, the aroma of it, maddened me. I believed I moaned aloud, but I did not reach for him. I would not. Then I remember seeing Lestat's figure emerge in the mirror over the sideboard. "Why did you do this?" he demanded. I turned to face him, determined he would not see me in this weakened state. The old man was delirious, he went on. He could not understand what the old man was saying. "The slaves, they know. You must go to the cabins and keep watch." I managed to say to him, "I'll care for the old man." "Kill him," Lestat said. "Are you mad?" I answered. "He's your father." "I know he's my father," said Lestat. "That's why you have to kill him. I can't kill him. If I could, I would have done it a long time ago. Damn him." He wrung his hands. "We've got to get out of here, and look what you've done killing this one. There's no time to lose. His wife will be wailing up here in minutes, or she'll send someone worse." The vampire sighed. This was all true. Lestat was right. I could hear the slaves gathering around Daniel's cottage, waiting for him. Daniel had been brave enough to come into the haunted house alone. When he didn't return, the slaves would panic, become a mob. I told Lestat to calm them, to use all his power as a white master over them, and not to alarm them with horror. And then I went into the bedroom and shut the door. I had then another shock in a night of shocks, because I'd never seen Lestat's father as he was then. He was sitting up now, leaning forward, talking to Lestat, begging Lestat to answer him, telling him he understood his bitterness better than Lestat did himself. And he was a living corpse, nothing animated, his sunken body but a fierce will. Hence his eyes for their gleam were all the more sunken in his skull, and his lips in their trembling made his old yellowed mouth more horrible. I sat at the foot of the bed, and suffering to see him so, I gave him my hand. I cannot tell you how much his appearance had shaken me, for when I bring death, it is swift and conscienceless, leaving the victim as if in enchanted sleep. But this was the slow decay, the body refusing to surrender to the vampire of time, which had sucked upon it for years on end. "Lestat," he said, "just for once, don't be hard with me. Just for once, be for me the boy you were, my son." He said this over and over, the words, my son. And then he said something I could not hear about innocence and innocence destroyed. But I could see that he was not out of his mind, as Lestat thought, but in some terrible state of lucidity. The burden of the past was on him with full force, and the present, which was only death, which he fought with all his will, could do nothing to soften that burden. But I knew I might deceive him if I used all my skill, and bending close to him now, I whispered the word, "Father." It was not Lestat's voice, it was mine, a soft whisper. But he calmed at once, and I thought then he might die. But he held my hand as if he were being pulled under by dark ocean waves, and I alone could save him. He talked now of some country teacher, a name garbled, found in Lestat, a brilliant pupil who begged to take him to a monastery for an education. He cursed himself for bringing Lestat home, for burning his books. "You must forgive me, Lestat," he cried. I pressed his hand tightly, hoping this might do for some answer, but he repeated this again. "You have it all to live for, but you are as cold and brutal as I was then, with the work always there, and the cold and hunger. Lestat, you must remember, you were the gentlest of them all. God will forgive me if you forgive me." Well, at that moment, the real Esau came through the door. I gestured for quiet, but he wouldn't see that, so I had to get up quickly so the father wouldn't hear his voice from a distance. "The slaves had run from him, but they're out there. They're gathered in the dark. I hear them," said Lestat. And then he glared at the old man. "Kill him, Louis," he said to me, his voice touched with the first pleading I'd ever heard in it. Then he bit down in rage. "Do it. Lean over that pillow and tell him you forgive him all. Forgive him for taking you out of school when you were a boy. Tell him that now." "For what?" Lestat grimaced so that his face looked like a skull. "Taking me out of school?" He threw up his hands and let out a terrible roar of desperation. "Damn him! Kill him!" he said. "No," I said. "You forgive him or you kill him yourself. Go on. Kill your own father." The old man begged to be told what we were saying. He called out, "Son, son," and Lestat danced like the maddened Rumpelstiltskin about to put his foot through the floor. I went to the lace curtains. I could see and hear the slaves surrounding the house of Pointe du Lac, forms woven in the shadows, drawing near. "You were Joseph among your brothers," the old man said, "the best of them. But how was I to know? It was when you were gone I knew, when all those years passed, and they could offer me no comfort, no solace. And then you came back to me and took me from the farm. But it wasn't you. It wasn't the same boy." I turned on Lestat now and veritably dragged him towards the bed. Never had I seen him so weak and at the same time enraged. He shook me off and then knelt down near the pillow, glowering at me. I stood resolute and whispered, "Forgive." "It's all right, father. You must rest easy. I hold nothing against you," he said, his voice thin and strained over his anger. The old man turned on the pillow, murmuring something soft with relief, but Lestat was already gone. He stopped short in the doorway, his hands over his ears. "They're coming," he whispered, and then turning just so he could see me, he said, "Take him, for God's sake." The old man never even knew what happened. He never awoke from his stupor. I bled him just enough, opening the gash so he would then die without feeding my dark passion. That thought I couldn't bear. I knew now it wouldn't matter if the body was found in this manner, because I had had enough of Pointe du Lac and Lestat, and all this identity of Pointe du Lac's prosperous master. I would torch the house and turn to the wealth I'd held under many names, safe for just such a moment. Meantime, Lestat was after the slaves. He would leave such ruin and death behind him no one could make a story of that night at Pointe du Lac, and I went with him. As before, his ferocity was mysterious, but now I bared my fangs on the humans who fled from me. My steady advance, overcoming their clumsy, pathetic speed as the veil of death descended, or the veil of madness. The power and the proof of the vampire was incontestable, so that the slaves scattered in all directions, and it was I who ran back up the steps to put the torch to Pointe du Lac. Lestat came bounding after me. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Are you mad?" But there was no way to put out the flames. "They're gone, and you're destroying it, all of it." He turned round and round in the magnificent parlor, amid his fragile splendor. "Get your coffin out. You have 3 hours till dawn," I said. The house was a funeral pyre. "Could that fire have hurt you?" asked the boy. "Most definitely," said the vampire. "Did you go back to the oratory? Was it safe?" "No, not at all. Some 55 slaves were scattered around the grounds. Many of them would not have desired the life of a runaway, and would most certainly go right to Frenière or south to the Beljardin plantation downriver. I had no intention of staying there that night, but there was little time to go anywhere else." "The woman Babette," said the boy. The vampire smiled. "Yes, I went to Babette. She lived now at Frenière with her young husband. Had enough time to load my coffin into the carriage and go to her." "But what about Lestat?" The vampire sighed. "Lestat went with me. It was his intention to go on to New Orleans, and he was trying to persuade me to do just that. But when he saw I meant to hide at Première, he opted for that also. We might not have ever made it to New Orleans. It was growing light, not so that mortal eyes would have seen it, but Lestat and I could see it.